Hello, everyone. It's June 28, 2026. I'm Cy Marie Johnson, and you are listening to Histories of Horror.
I'm A.O. Knuckles. Today, we are turning our sights to the high desert of the American Southwest, exploring a case that is vast, bleak, and deeply unsettling as the landscape it took place in. We are traveling to Albuquerque, New Mexico, specifically to a windswept plateau known as the West Mesa.
So, when we think of serial killers, we often look for a pattern in how they choose their victims or the signatures that they leave behind. But the monster we're discussing today relied on a different kind of strategy: absolute concealment. He used the unforgiving desert as a vault, hiding his horrific deeds beneath layers of caliche clay and blowing sand.
This wasn't just a dumping ground, Si. This was a systematic, clandestine cemetery. It stands as one of the largest unsolved serial homicide investigations in the United States history, and it all came to light by complete accident.
Imagine an area of undeveloped desert slated for suburban housing. A local resident is out walking her dog, enjoying a quiet afternoon, when the dog stops and starts pawing at a large, weathered bone sticking out of the dirt. At first, it looks like it could be from a stray animal or old cattle, but it's not. It's a human femur.
That single bone was a thread that unraveled a nightmare. By the time forensic teams finished excavating that desolate patch of dirt, they hadn't just found one person. They uncovered the remains of 11 young women and an unborn fetus.
An entire community of missing women, written off by many, but secretly gathered in a horrific anonymous graveyard. Who was the monster who hunted on the margins of Albuquerque? Let's break down how this desert horror story began.
The veil of secrecy lifted on a windy afternoon in February 2009. A woman walking her dog on the West Mesa Plateau noticed the pet unusually fixated on an object protruding from the dirt. Recognizing it as a bone, she took a photo and sent it to a detective she knew.
This triggered what would become a massive, agonizing archaeological dig. Investigators initially thought they were dealing with a single isolated homicide, but as police technicians carefully brushed away the packed desert soil, they found more bones, then another skull, then clothing, and the perimeter kept expanding.
For weeks, the West Mesa looked like an active archaeological dig site, tented off from the public. Heavy machinery was brought in to sift through tons of dirt. What they realized was truly chilling. The killer had specifically chosen a depression in the landscape, dug deep graves, and buried those women years prior, believing the suburban sprawl would never catch up to this graveyard.
As the remains were carefully exhumed, forensic pathologists faced a daunting task. The harsh desert heat, moisture, and shifting sands had heavily decomposed the bodies, leaving mostly skeletal remains. But as the dental records and DNA profiles began to match up, a heartbreaking picture emerged.
These weren't strangers to the Albuquerque Police Department. In fact, many of their names were already sitting on the missing police persons posters throughout the city's vice division. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers who had vanished without a trace between 2003 and 2005. The predator had been operating in plain sight, systematically thinning the population of vulnerable women in the desert kept a secret for over 4 years.
To understand the terror of the West Mesa Bone Collector, you have to look at who he targeted. The killer preyed heavily on a very specific demographic: young women, many of whom were struggling with substance abuse and relying on street level sex work to survive. They were women marginalized by society, the exact population a cynical predator knows might not be reported as missing right away.
Exactly. And because of their transient lifestyles, when these women stopped calling home, family members panicked. But law enforcement was slow to connect the dots. They assumed they had just left town, but they hadn't left town. They were buried side by side in the sand.
Let's talk about the lives cut short. Women like Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, and Veronica Romero. These were young women in their 20s. There was Michelle Valdez, who was 4 months pregnant when she vanished, meaning the killer took two lives when he buried her. The youngest victim was Jamie Barella, who was just 15 years of age. She vanished alongside her cousin, Evelyn Salazar.
Jamie's inclusion in the graveyard shattered the killer's supposed profile. She wasn't involved in drugs or sex work. She was just an innocent teenager who happened to be with her cousin on the wrong day. It proved the bone collector was just an opportunistic predator of the worst kind.
The realization that 11 women had vanished from the same geographic hub over a 2 year span without a single alarm bell ringing blast open a conversation about how society treats missing marginalized women. The media finally gave them names, but for the families, the closure of finding their remains was immediately replaced by a desperate demand for justice. Who was taking them? With an entire cemetery uncovered, a massive joint task force was established. Investigators looked at the timeline, 2003 to 2005, and realized something critical. The murders abruptly stopped after 2005. This suggested the killer had either died, been incarcerated for another crime, or moved away.
Timeline brought forward several terrifying suspects. The first major name was Fred Reynolds. Reynolds was a local pimp who knew many of the victims had a history of violent behavior. What made him incredibly suspicious of his massive collection of photos featuring missing women from the area. However, Reynolds died of natural causes in 2007, right in line with the timeline of when the killing stopped.
Then came Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya lived remarkably close to the West Mesa burial site. He had a violent history with sex workers. In December 2006, Montoya choked a teenager to death in his trailer. But his reign of terror ended that night when the victim's boyfriend tracked her down and shot Montoya dead. When police searched for Montoya's car after his death, they found dirt and physical evidence linking him geographically to the mesa, though a definitive forensic link to the bones remains elusive.
We also can't talk about the West Mesa without mentioning Joseph Blais, a convicted serial rapist known as the Midnight Rapist, who operated in Albuquerque for decades. Blais' yard contained a tag from a local escort service, and his timeline overlapped perfectly.
Despite these heavy hitters of criminality, the investigation ran into a wall that 1970s cases know all too well: the lack of high quality DNA or forensic material left on the skeletal remains. The desert wind and dry heat had scrubbed the evidence clean. No confessions were left behind, and no definitive match has ever closed the case.
Nearly 2 decades have passed since the last victim was buried on that plateau. The city of Albuquerque eventually turned the site into a memorial park, a place of reflection to ensure the women are never forgotten. But the question of who buried them still echoes through the canyon.
To this day, the West Mesa Bone Collector case remains officially unsolved. The task force has reviewed thousands of leads, but without a definitive forensic smoking gun, the file sits open.
Did the killer die, like Fred Reynolds or Lorenzo Montoya? Or is he sitting somewhere right now watching the desert horizon, knowing he successfully buried his dark secrets in the New Mexico sand?
The bones on the mesa stand as a sobering monument to the vulnerable. When predators hunt the margins of society, it is up to the rest of us to ensure the victims are searched for, remembered, and given a voice.
That wraps up today's journey into the dark corners of history. We want to thank you for listening to Histories of Horror.
We certainly do. And as always, a reminder: stay vigilant, look out for one another, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying secrets are right beneath your feet. Until next time, stay safe and have a good night. This has been Histories of Horror.